So very good morning to all of you. I want to add my thanks to Ronan and the organizers for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here, to meet former teachers, colleagues, and make new acquaintances, and I very much appreciate it. I also want to appreciate the attention to Tunisia, which I'm here to take you to this morning. With all respect to El Dunya, we were the first. So I'm glad that it's first in the revolutions. So I'm happy to take you on a quick trip to Tunisia today and talk a little bit about Tunisia and a lot about women and Tunisian policies towards women. I'll try to blend both. I also realize that I'm the first speaker, and I would like to perhaps raise questions that we can develop and debate later today. So I'm partially here to talk about Tunisia, partially also to generate further discussion. Tunisia is recognized as the pioneer of the 2011 Arab uprisings, and the first to establish the precedent of removing an authoritarian regime from power through protests and social pressure. Tunisia is also, or perhaps was, the only country in the Arab region that successfully navigated the transition to democracy. And that further promoted what's often referred to as the success paradigm that underpins most discussions about Tunisia. Tunisia's status as the poster child of the Arab uprisings is particularly surprising, given that Tunisia was a rather unlikely candidate for a popular uprising with a regional impact. Tunisia does not have a history of revolutions or of political violence. Since it achieved independence from France in 1956, it championed political and social stability. It stayed away from radical ideologies like Nasserism, and overall adopted a pretty moderate approach in managing its foreign relations. Although Tunisia lacks natural resources, it initially managed to develop a stable economy and provide a pretty good standard of living for its citizens. The country also witnessed the emergence of a middle class, which is something that we don't often see in other Arab settings. Now, this isn't a middle class perhaps the way it might be known in Western societies, but it's nevertheless a social demographic that is absent from other Arab settings. In another noteworthy feature, Tunisian women enjoyed unparalleled legal rights compared to other countries. They benefited from government policies and reform initiatives that enhanced their legal status and guaranteed greater social equality. At face value, that still holds true today. Najla Bouden is the Tunisian prime minister, the only woman to hold such a position in the region. So Tunisia, in sum, doesn't appear to be the likely setting for political and social upheavals. I also want to admit that it was not always the focus of scholarly research in Middle East studies. It has an unfair image of being rather sort of bland and unexciting country that kept away from the spotlight. And yet there was Tunisia on the evening of January 14th, 2011, when it learned that its authoritarian president, who had been in power since 1987, Zain El Abidine Ben Ali, fled the country and was granted asylum in Saudi Arabia. His departure followed weeks of intensifying protests against him, his regime's perceived corruption, brutality, and growing disconnect from the public. Rising economic difficulties also fueled public anger. These protests erupted after the self-immolation of a young Tunisian, Mohamed Bouazizi, in an act of despair after being repeatedly subjected to bureaucratic and police harassment. Bouazizi later succumbed to his wounds, but he became a symbol for frustrated Tunisians. The anti-regime protests spread from peripheral rural areas to the coastal urban centers. They gained momentum, and they incorporated broad swaths of Tunisian society. Among them were Tunisian women. Their involvement in this revolution was not specifically gender-oriented, but their unique legal status and social position provided them with an opportunity to participate in these protests and influence developments after them. So I want to discuss that opportunity today. What was the place of Tunisian women in public life prior to the revolution? What did that place reflect? How did it affect the Tunisian revolution? And I hope that some of this will be applicable to other settings that we'll be visiting later today. Tunisian society, just a minute. Tunisian society emerged from its independence struggle relatively unscathed compared to Algeria, for example. I have a map here of North Africa. You can see that in general, Tunisia is relatively small in size geographically, certainly compared to Algeria, Morocco, and Libya. It was also, Tunisia's struggle for independence was led by a very confident and bold leadership that had a very clear vision of what it wanted independent Tunisia to be. This leadership was embodied by Habib Bourguiba, the country's first president, and he enjoyed widespread popular support. He had a lot of political and social capital and a great amount of personal popularity, and they were the foundations of various moves made by Bourguiba after independence. He transformed Tunisia from a monarchy to a republic. He pursued moderate pro-Western policies and promoted, I don't like the word secular, but certainly a non-Islamist vision for Tunisian society. He pursued a modernist path that would often perhaps be unthinkable for an Arab leader to do today. And among these measures were policies that dramatically transformed the status of women. In any case, just in general, the population of Tunisia, well, this is from July 2020, was about 11 million, 11.7. I want to take you back to 2011. They were a little over 10 million. That's rather small for an Arab country. I'm having trouble here with the rest of the data, so I'll just provide you with two important things. One is the level of education, very high, certainly among women, about 86% literacy rate. I'm comparing that to Morocco, where it's rather low for women, about 70%. Moreover, even more, I think, perhaps related to that, is the relatively low birth rate, less than 1% per year. And again, that is a reflection of a very ambitious family planning program that Bourguiba initiated. One of the things, here's Bourguiba on the left, and while I'm at it, I'll introduce Zain El Abidine Ben Ali, and this is Kais Saied. We'll get to him at the end. He's Tunisia's current president. Bourguiba initiated a personal status code known by its French acronym CSP in 1956, and it was the first major legislative initiative in this regard. That code placed Tunisia at the forefront of women's rights, certainly in the Arab region, and it reads like a model for securing equality for women and removing barriers that blocked their advancement. The code abolished polygamy. It provided equal access to divorce proceedings. It eliminated the requirement for women to have a male guardian. It paved the way for Tunisians to gain an unparalleled set of rights. Women benefited from greater education opportunities, they were promoted to senior government positions, and they were integrated into many frameworks in a way that would be unrecognizable even to this day in many countries. Now, what's also important about the CSP is that it gained recognition amongst most Tunisians as a key component of Tunisian culture. Securing and advancing the role of women to this day remains a value, not sure the level of commitment, but at least it's spoken of as a value that nearly all political movements, including the Islamists, are, at least in principle, committed to. Now, I don't want to be dismissive in any way of these impressive achievements, but I want to take a closer look at the complex historical reality that underpinned them. And Ruth Roded last night talked about state feminism, and that's what we're looking at here. It's not accidental that I haven't so far mentioned any women involved in all of this, or women's organizations, and they weren't. Only in the 1980s did a significant women's movement in Tunisia emerge. All of these gender policies, which I've mentioned until now, were initiated from above. This was a state-run, performance-oriented campaign that cultivated a specific image for the country and also secured the ruling regime's authority. It wasn't a project of public debate or involvement. Now, I don't want to diminish these achievements. I also don't want to dismiss the fact that Tunisian leaders, particularly Bourguiba, chose to promote women as part of their efforts to create their own legacy. If you visit Bourguiba's tomb in his hometown of Monastir, there are many titles given to him, and one of the things that's mentioned there is that he is the liberator of women. Now, Bourguiba could have endorsed other causes, and instead he focused on women. But I do want to note this was a reform from above. It was a calculated choice of the Tunisian leadership. And women's rights in Tunisia, impressive as they are, reflect a pursuit of power, monopolization, and performance-oriented nature. So I'm not dismissing them, but I'm perhaps suggesting a different look at them. One key study on Tunisian women by Munira Sharad underscores how the CSP was part of a state-building strategy. It was aimed to weaken tribal frameworks and construct a modern, centralized state. This was a top-down model. Later studies went further and looked at the ways in which Tunisian leaders manipulated women's rights, largely done in order to maintain one-party rule and consolidate power. Some have even accused Bourguiba of being false and far from showing greater commitment to improving women's status. Monica Marks has shown in her work how Tunisian state support for women's rights often fluctuated, reflecting shifting political objectives and perceived threats. Again, I want to note here, these reforms did bring social changes and were embedded, but you have to be a little cautious in looking at them. Bourguiba, during the struggle for independence, maneuvered from, at times being, for example, emphasizing the veil, he called it a defense of national identity in danger. He referred to the veil as a consolidation of cultural solidarity. But after independence, he sought to marginalize religious structures, and later enacted a ban on veils. He referred to it as a rag in public settings. Still, Bourguiba remained identifiable with promoting women's rights. On the other hand, while state feminism introduced important legal rights in Tunisia, women in Tunisia still had various indirect forms of suppression, and they had to navigate their way through the regime's defined boundaries. So Tunisia's record on women's rights is more complicated than it appears. After being removed from power in 1987, allegedly for health reasons, that was Bourguiba, Tunisia's new leader, Ben Ali, remained committed also to pursuing that same state-oriented gender politics. Only in this case, Ben Ali was even more self-serving than Bourguiba. His political objectives, more than a genuine commitment to women's rights, were that's what generated his gender policy. He remained officially committed to advancing women's rights. He promoted himself as the defender of women against the Islamist threat. Women's rights were a focus of his regime, and they were featured prominently on the national agenda. Ben Ali convinced many at home and abroad that he was the lesser of two evils. It was either the Islamists or me. And he managed rather successfully to maintain an illusion of modernity that hid many of the human rights abuses. And the state performance strategy was part of that campaign. Ben Ali actually didn't do that much to advance women. He introduced some reforms in 1993, including greater options for child custody in the case of divorce, but more problematic issues like inheritance laws, which kept women at a disadvantage, were left untouched. Unmarried women with children were also not recognized. And women suspected of contacts with banned groups, primarily the Islamists, were harassed, detained, tortured, and abused. Members of women organizations later admitted, after the Ben Ali regime's collapse, that they were not able to operate freely during that era. Frankly, no other organization was. Much of their agenda was frequently co-opted by the regime to promote Ben Ali's power. To make matters worse, Ben Ali's very unpopular second wife, Leila Trabelsi, associated herself with women's organizations that she officially directed. And she became the face of Tunisia's state choreographed women's politics, and that further alienated many Tunisians from any feminist cause. But for the regime, the approach was successful, and Tunisia really did acquire an international reputation for being women-friendly. Tunisian women gained traction and became identified across Tunisian society. I'm just noting that the national airline Tunisair has women pilots. Compare that to Saudi Arabia, where only recently they received a driver's license, the ability to drive. So these are all examples that I'm not dismissing. I also want to note that this goes back to our discussion of periphery yesterday. The interior, more religious regions were less involved with some of these policies, and they were largely absent from the discussions concerning women's rights. But again, the Tunisian Revolution erupted in that periphery, in Sidi Bouzid, a town that I doubt anyone had ever heard of before that. This is 200 kilometers south of the capital, Tunis. Protesters were furious over the regime's corruption, brutality, and economic failures. Now, women rallied against the regime, and unrelated to gender policies, they joined that revolution. Rural women, like men, felt alienated from the state. And across Tunisia, many women were already engaged in activism and could easily help organize protests. Other women stood out as information providers through blogs and other online activities, and this was another component of the protests that contributed to the revolution's success. To some degree, these women were protesting against state feminism, but in general, they focused on hopes for a better life. Early protests also focused mostly on economic and social conditions. Women were also subjected during these protests to repression, harassment from security forces. That included sexual assault and other crude anti-women sentiments, sometimes from male demonstrators. Apologize here for the language. Go back to your kitchens, you whores, was often said at these rallies. What more do you want? Do you want to become men? Now, this sort of verbal and physical reaction, the extent of which is not clear, it does indicate that these state-oriented, top-down feminist policies were not as deeply entrenched in society as one might have thought. Not all anti-regime protesters had positive feelings towards gender equality. And there was certainly, and this was also mentioned yesterday, that uncertainty and general anxiety that follows political upheavals can also release a lot of genies from bottles. I'm stopping here for 1 minute, and I'm also looking here at the time. There's one thing I want to stretch here. The peculiar features of the Tunisian Revolution. Yes, these protests multiplied, but I would not say that Tunisia, there was no Tahrir Square. And I often wonder, I don't want to do counterfactual history, but what might have happened had Ben Ali not announced that he was fleeing? I can't really say that if you look at Charles Tilly's theories, that Tunisia didn't really experience a revolutionary moment when you had a credible alternative that was ready. There was a lot of, I don't want to say coincidence, but things evolved in a rather unplanned way. Now, only after Ben Ali left, that's when you can start talking about a revolutionary situation in Tunisia. The regime effectively collapsed. The Tunisian military indicated that it would not intervene in any way. That's another important feature of Tunisia. But what also changed here was that the politics from above that was part of Tunisian public life now became politics from below. The model in which the government decides for society without a public debate was removed. Tunisian citizens were given a voice and an ability to express their demands. This doesn't mean a linear process that reflected a true shift in politics and institutions. And even in successful Tunisia, this has been highly problematic. But the state performance-oriented approach to women's rights had ended. And now Tunisian women found themselves with opportunities to increase in public life. Civil society, which was already developing under Ben Ali, really grew. Tunisian women were part of the post-revolutionary debates concerning Tunisia's future identity. New women's groups were also present. I'm thinking about Ennahda, the Islamists, who stated their commitment to the CSP. Ennahda was careful not to appear as a threatening force. And indeed, the celebrated Tunisian constitution, which was framed in 2015, talks about gender equality between men and women. And that was a major success in that evolved. But even from a bottom-up political system, and I'm not going into the current situation in Tunisia right now, it's far from successful. One of the obstacles that remains in Tunisia, I wrote this before current events in Israel, is the absence of a strong independent judiciary and a separation of power between government branches. Nathan Brown and others have emphasized that judicial independence is crucial for protecting human rights, stability, and economic development. And Tunisia's legal system remains very weak. Even before Kais Saied, this combination of weak institutions and embedded social norms did not bode well for women in Tunisia, however successful it may have appeared. To conclude, Tunisia presents many questions and dilemmas concerning women's rights that I hope we can discuss in further sessions, and particularly that interplay between top-down and bottom-up politics and the impact of performance-oriented state gender policies on wider social questions. These are not topics with easy answers, and I hope the Tunisian experience at the very least provides us with some food for thought. Thank you.